headlines on the India development debate. Big diplomatic victory for India at the BRICS summit in China, endorsing Prime Minister Modi's call for a united fight against global terror. The Shaman declaration names Pakistan-based militant outfits Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba as perpetrators of terror.
In a clear indication of the changing global power equations, Chinese President Xi Jinping seeks a greater role for BRICS in the world's governance, launching an attack against the Western dominance in global fora. Jinping says there is an increasing need to make the world order more just and equitable, also calls for a comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council.
BRICS slams the protectionist policies of the West, calling for a more open global economy. Without naming any country, the Shaman declaration says there is an urgent need to guard against inward-looking tendencies that could undermine global growth. Also asks members to tweak their policies to facilitate easier trade between member countries.
After the BRICS Development Bank, Prime Minister Modi pitches for dedicated ratings agencies for the economic bloc. The Prime Minister says the joint rating agency will help overcome curbs in accessing the contingent reserve agreement, which is dominated by US-based S&P, Moody's and Fitch. Also calls for greater coordination between BRICS central banks at IMF and World Bank. This indeed is Modi versus Moody's.
All eyes on the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping tomorrow morning. The meeting comes days after the two countries called off a military standoff at the Doklam Tri-Junction near Bhutan. Trade and economic ties between the two countries will also figure high on the agenda.
Good evening. This really is a big win for Prime Minister Modi and his men, a big diplomatic boost for India at the Shaman BRICS summit, as all BRICS nations, including China, endorsed India's stance against Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. The joint declaration named Pak-based terror outfits Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed for the unrest in the region. This is a big win for Prime Minister Modi, who raised the issue of terrorism strongly at the BRICS summit. Experts assert this is especially significant given the Beijing endorsement, which comes after 2 months of very heightened war of words and beyond at Doklam.
But this evening, we want to know, can BRICS be a force to reckon with? Can it counter G7's strategic influence? Can India and China converge and compete at the same time? And for how long will the developed world deny the significance of over 42% of global population? And how long will it take for BRICS to rebalance the global power and economic equations? I'm Sandeep. Gurumurthi. Joining me in Delhi is my colleague Supriya, Shrinate. With an aim to rise with India, we debate the BRICS power push on the India development debate this Monday evening.
It's a big diplomatic victory for India. Days after dissolving the Doklam border crisis, it was India's day at the 9th BRICS summit in Xiamen, China. The bonhomie between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping is visible once again. After all, India did the near impossible, as all the BRICS nations, including China, in a 43-page declaration, has not just unequivocally condemned terror and those responsible for organizing and supporting it, but also named Pakistan-based terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Haqqani network for committing dastardly attacks. While the Xiamen declaration stopped short of naming Pakistan China's close ally, the shift in the Chinese view is being seen as a big positive. Ever since Prime Minister Modi declared Pakistan as a mothership of all terrorism in the last BRICS summit held in Goa.
I'm sure leaders when they meet like this are bound to look at it, including the scourge of terrorism, which has been a very important subject for us. We'd raised it in the Goa summit as well, and I'm sure it will revisit us at this summit as well.
The Xiamen declaration in fact referred to terrorism at least 17 times, while calling all nations to adopt a comprehensive approach in combating terrorism and blocking terror financing.
As far as India is concerned, the principal issue is terrorism emanating from Pakistan. China continues to stand behind Pakistan in totality, says Masood Azhar is not an international terrorist. Same for Sayyid Salahuddin.
But the opposition is not happy. The Congress believes the Doklam peace is only temporary.
The Prime Minister, I think, owes it to the country to ask the Chinese that your foreign ministry spokespersons, not once, but 4 times over have said that Chinese troops will continue to remain stationed in Doklam. What does this mean?
While China has called out Pak-based terror groups, it needs to be seen whether Beijing will walk the talk when it comes to UN sanctions on terrorists hiding on Pakistani soil as well. But in the meantime, experts take heart from how the East is finally coming together. And as Modi and Xi meet again for their bilateral talks tomorrow, can they take the bonhomie forward, open a frontier for rebalancing global economy? We debate the BRICS power push in the India development debate. Ruchi Bhatia, ET Now, New Delhi.
Viewers, given the importance of this topic, tonight we've decided to not invite politicians on the panel. We've got 5 of India's finest strategic and diplomatic affairs experts joining us on the India development debate because we've got much ground to cover. I'd urge all my guests to keep their comments crisp and precise because we have a lot of ground to cover. We've not invited politicians. It's just the 5 of you. Meera Shankar, former top diplomat. Rajat Nag of the NCER. He's been the chief of the Asian Development Bank as well. Maruf Raza and Sushant Sareen, both of them are one of India's top strategic affairs experts. And we're also joined by Samir Saran of the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking time out and joining us live on the India development debate. Maruf Raza, I'm going to start off with you. Given the fact that this is the first time that there's been an explicit endorsement of terror emanating from Pakistan, the fact that Pak-based terror groups have been named in this joint BRICS statement, how significant a breakthrough is this? How significant is this development from India's point of view?
Yeah, it is extremely significant for 3 or 4 reasons. One is that you may recall that in the Goa summit which India hosted, we were not able to get the kind of declaration that is there on the table now, in which Pakistan-based terror groups have also been very clearly identified. They tried to shift the focus in the last Goa summit to issues like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and some other groups that operate out of Central Asia, more to kind of look at issues that were of concern to the West and Russia and other international members of the BRICS panel. But now here we are very clear that we have broken ground, and this breaking of ground comes in the background of the fact that China's government, I believe, had issued very clear instructions that they did not want to drag Pakistan into this debate on terrorism, even if India decided to raise the issue. The question mark was whether India would or not. I think Mr. Modi and his government has done us well. Now, the second point to understand is that while the opposition parties in India continue to keep criticizing all the breakthroughs that our government has been making, but they must also come out and admit that they never covered themselves with glory when dealing with China related with border or any other issues where China had been proxying up, building up Pakistan as a strong proxy against India, primarily to serve China's hegemonistic agendas in Asia by keeping India preoccupied with China. But most importantly, I think what we need to understand is that China wants to be seen in the international community to go by the rules of the game. Being a member of the UN Security Council, the resolution 1267 is binding on all countries, and China cannot continue to give it a broad brush. Whatever they do eventually on the ground and how true they are to their commitment, only time will tell. I have my reservations about that.
Right.
But quite clearly, this all-encompassing resolution against terrorism brings in also the interests of countries like America and others who have been focusing on Taliban. So it is not Pakistan-centric, but it's certainly terrorism-centric. It certainly builds into the narrative the government of India is building in. And I think we have made good ground. We must capitalize on it and not let the initiative die.
Okay. Samir Saran, I'm going to throw this to you. While Maruf Raza believes this is a significant victory and one that brings glory to the country, I'm going to ask you a little uncomfortable question. Everybody's claiming victory there. How are you reading this? Simply because this doesn't name Pakistan, this doesn't even talk about Masood Azhar. Are we being euphoric all of a sudden all over again?
Let me make 2 points, and without disagreeing with Maruf, in fact, let me complement what he has said. I think what we are seeing today is a reset in both the BRICS dynamics, because I think in the second decade, this is the end of innocence. We have seen a major contest, a near conflict between two of its largest members. So the BRICS going forward is going to have to take this into account. And second, we've also seen India not only face off the Chinese at Doklam, but also in a sense reject the Belt and Road Initiative, and it seemed for a while that India would be lonely there, but it has done reasonably well in pulling together a counter narrative and also being able to convince some others that a world exists outside of the Belt and Road. So I think this is the backdrop in which this meeting was hosted by the Chinese. So I think the first point I want to make is that I think the Chinese are also beginning to realize that they cannot rebuff India at every juncture. Now, I agree with Maruf, this may not hold, and come the UN, the Chinese may shield Masood Azhar again, but I do believe that the Chinese will have to rethink how they approach India. That's the first point. The second, of course, is that in any document such as this, there is a give and take, and perhaps the Chinese were more concerned on the North Korea front at this stage, and a weak BRICS statement in terms of condemning North Korea would suit them more, and perhaps there was a bit of a negotiation there. But having said that, let's be very clear that on Chinese soil, on a Chinese draft, if you are able to name groups operating out of Pakistan, it certainly is a diplomatic coup. And let's not worry about the sustainability of the Chinese position, but as Maruf mentioned, I think we will have to make sure that we can do much more with this little victory that we have gained at Xiamen. But I think the other operating paragraphs certainly, and I believe we'll have time to discuss that, 10 and 11, which talk about economic convergence and economic opportunities, perhaps are more important as far as the BRICS grouping is concerned. There is a symbolic element. I think we have done well there. We need to convert some of the real gains we can get on the economic convergence as well.
All right, we will talk about those points as well, as far as economic convergence is concerned. But before I go to Meera Shankar, I want to talk about this Twitter poll. We did a Twitter poll on whether India scored a win at BRICS. 69% of those who participated in the poll said yes, 19% said no, 12% said can't say. Meera Shankar, how do you read the breakthrough at Xiamen? Would you call it a significant move forward in the fact that, let's not lose sight of what is this coming in the context of a really long, bitter standoff at Doklam, which saw warmongering by Chinese, as many would say. In the context of that development, would you call this a significant win for India? In the context of that development, would you call
it's positive for India, and it's an evolution in the position that we saw at the last BRICS summit, because you have the naming of these groups of concern to India in the context of violence in the region, and not only groups of concern to India, but also those of concern to Russia and to China. So it names, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda's affiliates such as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is of concern to China, the Uzbekistan Islamic Movement, which is of concern to both Russia and China. It names Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and the Haqqani group, and it names the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is again of concern to both Russia and China in Central Asia. So in a sense, it takes into account the concerns of all the BRICS members, and that's a positive, because what we saw in the past was that there was a reluctance to take India's concerns on board. Having said that, these kind of diplomatic statements have symbolic value in terms of the actual struggle against terrorism and the terrorism that we face. I'm not sure that it will have a very strong impact. We still have to see how China is going to how it's going to behave with regard to designation of Masood Azhar. After all, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, all these groups have been on the UN sanctions list. They've been designated by the UN Security Council, and China has gone along with that. Having gone along with that, it has opposed the designation of the leader of one of these groups. So there is a contradiction in their actual position, and in giving a clarification on this, the Chinese spokesman basically skirted the issue and said that they had agreed to naming because of the violence in the region and because these groups are designated by the UN.
Right. I'm actually going to take a cue from what you just said in the last part of your answer, skirted the issue. So, Sareen, can India really take China at face value? I mean, Pakistan is and always perhaps will be an all-weather ally. Can India really trust China? Because, I mean, just 2 weeks back, there was warmongering on the Doklam issue, and suddenly we are strategic partners, and there is a whole lot of convergence that everybody is talking about. Can India trust China is the moot question there?
I don't think India can either trust China or any other country in the world, and I don't think we should trust any country in the world. I think countries will operate on the basis of their national interests, so should we. To the extent the interests converge and we work together and we get something out of it, great. To the extent they diverge, we'll differ with it. So the question of trust and all, I frankly have very little use for these words. But look, I think the point has been made very validly that compared to what happened last year in Goa, this is a major forward movement. But not just because groups like Lashkar and Jaish have been named, but also groups like the Taliban and Haqqani network have been named. Now, considering the fact that the Russians and the Chinese have been, in a sense, flirting with the Taliban and the Chinese to an extent with the Haqqani network because of their backing for Pakistan, I think that is fairly significant to my mind. But let's just go beyond this. I think there are a couple of other things in this entire declaration which are just as important. For example, this bit about there being no justification for terrorism whatsoever, which basically punctures this whole argument of root causes giving rise to terrorism. Now, that is something which has often been used to, like Meera Shankar was saying, skirting around the issue of terrorism, or flirting with some of these terrorist organizations under one pretext or another. The other thing is that the declaration talks about countries or people, whoever is committing, supporting and organizing terrorism, which is a clear indication to state sponsors of terror, and we know which is the country which is the biggest state sponsor of terror in the region. Then you come to this bit about putting the responsibility for fighting terrorism on states. That is clearly shooting, this whole nonsense of non-state actors which are working, and we don't know these were non-state actors. The Pakistani state had nothing to do with it. While the name of Pakistan is not being taken, the reference that states are responsible for acting against these organizations, I think it's very important. Then the issue of Financial Action Task Force and calling for the implementation and the strengthening of the Financial Action Task Force, the parameters which are there in the FATF. I think that again is very important, and we've seen that have an impact on Pakistan in the case of Hafiz Saeed.
Okay.
But having said this, one of the reasons why we have been kind of happy about what the new American policy has been, I found it a little incongruous for the reference to this business about taking unilateral action, imposing economic sanctions, or taking unilateral coercive measures, all of which actually we would very much like countries like the US and some of the other more powerful countries to take against rogue nations like Pakistan. So,
sure.
It's a little incongruous to also have that. But then when you have a 50-page declaration, I suppose these kind of contradictions are going to come in.
Okay, there will be a few contradictions, but we've made significant progress. I think that's a consensus view of all our panelists. I don't usually like this too much of consensus on the debate, but this is something that we would welcome for sure. I don't think anyone's going to dispute the fact that we've made progress. But, before we go to Rajat Nag, I want to pose one question to you, Maruf Raza, which is the fact that even as we celebrate this consensus and the fact that we moved forward on BRICS, and this is BRICS power that's at the forefront once again, I want to remind the fact that we can't lose sight of certain realities. Take the case of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is being spearheaded by China, the single biggest initiative that they've been that they've been pushing through, which is completely against the territorial interests of India, whichever way you look at it. And more importantly, it's only, from my point of view, it's very clear the objective of that is only to push, China's dominance in the region, right? How can India, on the one hand, be put its foot down on initiatives like this, and the other hand, try and converge on issues? Isn't this completely incongruous in many ways?
Yeah, it appears on the face of it as incongruous, but let me sort of use a phrase from Bharat Karnad's book, When Can India Be a Great Power? Or How Can India Be a Great Power? Why India is not a great power. Basically, the thesis that Bharat weaves is that India has the capacity, both strategically, economically, and geographically, to play the role of a swing state. Now, the swing state is one of those rarities in geopolitics today, which can actually play the game based on the emerging narrative in some kind of group or the other. Now, please understand, there are three elements to your question. The first is, how can India play this role? Because India is straddling both the major narratives that are coming out in geopolitics today. One led by the US, which is essentially to have a greater focus in Asia Pacific, the Indian Ocean region, etc., where the US sees India, amongst other countries, as a major friend and an ally. Now, the other thing is that the Chinese have realized that despite their ability or with having a huge economy and military power to try and browbeat India, they weren't able to do that. The Doklam incident was therefore a strategic game turner. And therefore, the Chinese have realized reluctantly that, you have to give space to India. Because not just in pure military terms, but even in economic terms, we have a BRICS bank. India is a big contributor there. There is an Indian who heads the bank. There are various projects in Asia where the BRICS bank can actually play a proactive role. They're already playing a proactive role in energy, water, etc. So therefore, this is an initiative with India and China can work towards to counter the whole cartel of Western initiatives that comes on economic issues from IMF, World Bank, etc. So there is a role that India can play in that camp without getting too thick into China's quilt. And finally, and most importantly, the point raised by Mr. Saran and Sushant Sareen about really, can you name Pakistan? Can you do the One Belt, One Road initiative? There are red lines between India and China on those two issues. And quite frankly, the devil is going to be in the details, as Madam Meera Shankar said. We have to get into the details of the case. We have to be aggressive. We have to have a much, much more proactive approach to getting on with the Indian agenda. The One Belt, One Road initiative is essentially a Chinese initiative to create markets for Chinese goods. We are not going to provide a market for Chinese goods across the board. We will be selective about it, and that's the message that Mr. Modi wants to give out.
Right. Talking about cartelization, you were of course talking about the BRICS versus the rest, but I have a question for Mr. Nag here. And Mr. Nag, how wary should India be with China's dominance even within the BRICS as far as the economic dominance is concerned? Look at the figures and how badly they stack against us. We imported goods worth $59 billion on last count from China, which was actually more than Sweden and US put together. And that was number 2 and 3 importers of Chinese goods. Chinese imports are now going to 70 countries. That's 1/3 of the globe. So look at the rising influence and dominance that China has, economically speaking, within the BRICS. Is this an equitable relationship of any kind, and how wary should India be of this?
Certainly an imbalanced relationship. The figures that you mentioned, Supriya, verify that. But let me take a slightly longer term perspective to put this in context. The Asian Development Bank a few years back did a study that by 2050, China and India together would constitute about 36% of the global GDP. China would be 20%, India would be number 2 at 16, and USA would be number 3. Population-wise, again by 2050, China and India would account for 1/3 of the globe's population. India would be number 1 at about 17%, China would be about 15–16%. So I think while we talk about these issues, and I fully agree with what my colleagues on the panel have mentioned about the immediate, I think China and India will have such a huge influence and a responsibility on the global stage, let alone the regional stage, that China and India will have to work together. And a point, therefore, that you raised, Supriya, a question, can India trust China? I think the question is, I don't think we have a choice. We, not just India trusting China, China has to trust India. We'll have the two countries together will have a major say in the global governance, major say on the global commons environment, for example, global financial infrastructure. Sandeep had mentioned about at the global institutions like the UN. So I think we really need to think beyond just the immediate. I share the concerns that you have mentioned. China will always be a much larger economy. It's about 5 times larger now. But India will be number 2. It is actually already number 3 in purchasing power parity terms. So let's not always frame this debate as India versus China. I think it's India and China together really making a big difference at the global scene, not only the regional.
That's a fantastic point that you've made there, and that's something that we do want to talk about in the back half of this debate as well. But Samir Saran, just to pick up from what Mr. Rajat Nag there said, and you wrote about this as well in a column in a leading newspaper a few days ago, which is that India on the one hand should stare the dragon in the eye when it comes to political issues and should not concede political space at any cost, and yet look for every possible opportunity to work together and collaborate as far as economic issues are concerned. Is that possible? Is that the very nature of this partnership, one of an opportunistic alliance between the two countries?
Add to something Sushant said, we must throw the word trust out of the playbook, and we must also throw our own attempts at creating a grand unified theory of our relationship with China. I think our relationship with China will always have 2 very strong facets. One is that India will learn how to, or will have to learn how to be politically muscular in protecting its territorial and sovereign concerns. And India will at the same time have to take a page out of the Chinese playbook and learn the fine art of extracting bountiful of opportunities that China's growth offers us. I agree with Professor Nag. I think India's most important relationship, or rather I would say the most important relationship of the 21st century, is going to be the engagement between these 2 Asian powerhouses. There is no Asian century if India and China don't engage with each other. In fact, let me add to something that was mentioned in the panel already. One of the banks that was missed out on, it was the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where India is the 2nd largest investor. It's a Chinese bank, and India had the confidence to be an investor in that particular institution. And I am quite certain that in the years ahead, one of the largest recipients of flows from both the NDB and the AIIB would perhaps be India and projects in India. I think what the BRICS does in many ways is offer a proxy for the 2 countries to do with each other, which would be impossible to do if they had to do it bilaterally. I think it's one of those mechanisms, flexibility mechanisms, that allows us to sell many undertakings and many partnerships to our own people, even as we continue, and we will continue to have political contestation. Let me add one last point, and I think this is important. Not only will we have to be smart in terms of gaining from China's rise, like the Chinese were in terms of their being able to extract value from the US and Taiwan and Japan, even as they had political differences with them. We will also have to be very clever in how we create trading regimes, because please understand, the original progenitors of the open and liberal trading system no longer are invested in that form of globalization. In many ways, it will have to be China, India, some of the other emerging economies, Brazil when it gets its act together, and other African countries who will have to infuse new life into an open and liberal trading system. The Chinese may not want it to be too liberal, and that's where we will need to be clever. How can we continue the project globalization, engage China robustly and gainfully in that, and yet have the wisdom to be able to carve a political space for us to oppose them when they start infringing on our sovereign concerns.
Meena Shankar, I'm going to throw this to you, and I like one of the points that Samir Saran was making there, that this multilateral fora perhaps gives us an opportunity to do what we wouldn't do in bilateral talks. And the direct question is, can we not concede political space and yet converge on, say, economic issues, yet make economic progress? Is that going to be possible, or do you believe strategic competition will get in the way of us leveraging what can be good bilateral economic ties?
If you look at it today, is fairly fluid, and no relationships have a unidimensional imprint. If you look at the US-China relationship, it's one of enormous economic engagement and at the same time of strategic competition. If you look at Russia-China, it's one of economic and strategic engagement, and yet of strategic limitations, because Russia has its own concerns about China. Similarly, for India, I think we will have a relationship with China which will be of both cooperation where we can and of strategic competition at the same time, which we will seek to manage so that it doesn't go out of hand. As far as BRICS is concerned, I would see it as partly a response to this fluid international situation, because what we are doing is to carve out flexible geometry, a flexible geometry of international cooperation. So while we are part of Russia, India, China, we are part of BRICS, we are also part of US, Japan, India trilateral dialogue. We have very strong strategic partnerships with both the US and Japan. We are also part of other groupings such as the G20, and all these groupings will continue. So what it means is that we don't put ourselves exclusively in one at the cost of other potential areas of cooperation. And where BRICS has been useful for India is to provide diplomatic space for pursuing what we believe is the need for democratization of the international system. India's voice alone matters. We have the developing countries with us, but it requires greater weight if we have China, Brazil, South Africa, Russia also speaking with us. So where we've seen BRICS as a useful forum is really in the field of global diplomacy and in the field of trade and economic cooperation and strengthening that potential.
All right.
There are limitations. Look at the UN Security Council reform. China does not support it. And if you see the support India's permanent membership or Brazil's permanent membership,
right.
If you see the paragraph in the declaration, it's anodyne. It talks of UN Security Council reform, including a greater representation of developing countries, and they understand the importance of the desire of India, Brazil, and South Africa to play a greater role in the UN. So
sure.
Anodyne and ambivalent. Therefore, there are limits as well. And I think and I think India is being smart
right.
In terms of using the potential while recognizing the limits.
All right, India is being smart in terms of using the potential. Maruf Faza, I know you want to comment, but I tell you what, I want to take a quick break because we have a lot of ground to cover. A quick break, we'll come back and continue the discussion. I want to talk about whether the influence of BRICS as a whole is waning because of the economic realities of today. 10 years back, BRICS was a talk of the town, given the fact that Brazil, Russia, and South Africa were economic powerhouses in the making as well. Not anymore. Is BRICS standing on just two legs, India and China, and what does that do to what India and China how India and China can benefit from BRICS is what we're going to debate. But as we slip into this break, I want our viewers to listen to what Jim O'Neill has to say. Remember, Jim O'Neill was the man who coined the acronym BRIC. Originally, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, as the countries that are going to lead the global economy in the 21st century. Let's see what he has to say about the potential of the BRIC, and more importantly, how India can benefit in the new global economic order. He spoke exclusively to ET now just a few days back. Here are excerpts of his comments.
I don't like the idea that all emerging markets should be regarded as one and the same, but nonetheless, people still do. But it's very difficult to generalize. That said, secondly, I think most so-called emerging markets are relatively cheap compared to particularly the United States. So from a value perspective, in a rising overall global market, I would expect many so-called emerging markets to continue to outperform the developed markets. Thirdly, however, as and when the Federal Reserve Board, if it does, start sending signs of accelerating tightening more than markets currently think, I would imagine that will be a period where a number of so-called emerging markets, possibly including India, might go through a more volatile phase. I quickly add, it's not clear to me that we are there now. The Fed still seems to be sending a very strong message that they're going to be very cautious in raising interest rates. India is in a slightly better position to withstand an adverse move in global markets.
It's so good to be back with you on the India development debate right here on ET Now. We're putting the spotlight on BRICS, and I'm going to take a question straight to Sushant Sareen here. Sushant, let's talk about BRICS as a grouping and the need for this grouping, which represents almost 42.5% of the global population, to have more say in global decision making. Do you believe that's utopian? It's too lofty an ambition?
You know, if you look at the declaration today, honestly, you know, we pretty much solved all the world's problems. Every single hotspot of the world has been mentioned, but what are we going to do about it? Where is the heft that we are going to bring to actually, you know, put our weight behind many of those problems, ranging from Africa to God knows where? So clearly, I think BRICS as an organization is a little too heavy on the verbiage and quite light on actually doing something. Yes, sure, the New Development Bank and some of the other initiatives have been there, but other than that, I think it's just a bit of a talking shop. You know, in your initial statement, you were talking about comparing it in a way with G7. Now, G7 is also an alliance of sorts led by America. In the case of BRICS, there is no such thing. Now, I agree with all the statements which were made about the India-China relationship, but the fact of the matter is we are not asking what does China want out of the relationship. Does China look at India in the same manner as, you know, we would like to imagine, you know, our relationship with China? I'm not entirely convinced of that. And I'm not sure that the Chinese would want to see, you know, a strong, relatively, you know, more aggressive sort of an India coming in its neighborhood, becoming a big power both economically as well as militarily, also having a lot of political influence. So clearly the Chinese intentions do not seem to be what we would like to imagine them to be. Now, I would agree that if the Chinese were as sensible as very often they are made out to be, they would see a lot of merit in the kind of discussions which have happened today in your program. But I'm not entirely sure they look at it that way. So ultimately, I think the strategic contestation between the two countries is probably going to define the relationship more than any economic interaction between them. I wish I'm wrong, but I don't see that happen because of the kind of aggressiveness and assertiveness that the Chinese have been doing over the last few years, ever since they actually became, in a manner of speaking, top dogs as far as the global economy is concerned. They've been throwing money all over the place, they've been buying influence, and they've been pretty much doing what the Americans had done in the early part of the last century. So clearly there is going to be a problems between India and China. If we can manage them, as Samir was talking about, I think that would be good. But somewhere along the line, I see problems coming on between both countries.
All right, that's a more realistic assessment of the situation on the ground. There may be sort of significant reasons for the two countries to work together, but it will be easier said than done. But Professor Nag, to talk about the larger sort of imperative of BRICS as a grouping together, the fact of the matter is you would know more than anyone else that 42% of the population, or more than 42% of the population, is represented by the BRICS grouping. Yet, only about 14, the IMF has only 14% quota for BRICS nations. In the World Bank, only 13% voting rights are with BRICS nations. Why should a country like India and China agree to these old world economic orders in today's day and age, when these are the economic powerhouses of the future, when they are driving global economic growth? Why should we find this acceptable in the first place?
Couldn't agree more with you, and I've spoken and written on this point, and that is exactly why the BRICS Bank actually came about, the NDB and then the AIIB. It is definitely an anachronism that some countries in Europe, small countries in Europe, and Meera Shankar would know this better than anybody else, have a greater voting right than China, certainly have much more than India. So yes, I think this balance has to change. And the reality is that the center of economic gravity is moving eastwards. And as I said, China and India, but Asia as a whole will account for more than half the global output by 2050, up from about 26% now. So I think this shift is inevitable. At what pace it will happen and how soon will the developed countries sort of, give way remains to be seen. But as I think one has said this often and heard often, that if we won't get a place at the table, we'll go and create our own kitchen and the table. And that's what we have done.
That's what we've done. I sometimes wonder where will that take us, but we're going to discuss that as well. We're going to discuss the kitchen we've created when we did not get an equitable table that we could sit on. But Maruf Raza, let me bring this to you. Many in the West still refer to BRICS as this talking shop. Do you believe that's being unfair? Do you believe that's at least denying BRICS the influence that it has? For the sheer number of people it represents, forget about anything else, forget about any emerging markets, forget about the fact that emerging markets contribute to half the world's growth now, forget about the fact that the GDP of these 5 nations put together in the last 10 years has more than trebled. But I'm just asking you, from the sheer number of people it represents, calling BRICS just a talking shop, is that denying its influence?
No, whoever did that was probably feeling very nervous and threatened ever since BRICS came about, because it was eating into their established coterie of groups that they were comfortable operating with. And yes, all organizations take a while to find their final shape and structure. BRICS has limitations, as has been brought out by the distinguished speakers, primarily because Brazil and South Africa are not promoting the kind of growth that India and China are giving. And Russia has its own important role to play, economic growth notwithstanding. Militarily, it's still the second most powerful country in the world. So therefore, having Russia in the grouping provides a counter narrative to the American-led groups of West, NATO, whatever else. But what we need to understand is 2 or 3 quick points. One is that, this whole talk about India and China strategic equation. Please understand that China doesn't have good relations with Japan, with Taiwan, even Korea, but they are some of China's biggest trading partners. So I think China, and Beijing in particular, is very smart, is able to do good trade with countries regardless of what the relationship militarily, strategically is on the ground. And I think that's a situation that will continue to prevail between India and China. We have to dig our heel in, we have to identify what are our strategic interests and guard them. The second thing we need to understand is China's entire Brick Road initiative is basically all about China's exports, and in most countries China is running into problems there. It's trying to buy its way into it with the One Belt, One Road initiative, but quite frankly, it is not making much headway. Only in countries like Pakistan, where it has virtually bought them out hook, line and sinker as a vassal state, that China is boasting about, that this being a flagship event. India has very little to gain from it. India has its own concerns, and these initiatives are going to be funded with an Indo-Japanese partnership and various others. So we don't have to worry about what China is trying to do. They were trying to bring in the OBOR or the BRI through a backdoor entry. And finally, and most importantly, Sandeep, I'd like you to really remember that there is a very important point, and I'd like officers of the Foreign Service to contest me on this, that while India has this grand vision, Modi is trying to do and kind of have India's footprint all over the place, we have a problem of capacity. We have the smallest foreign service that any big country can think of. We have smaller foreign service staff than even Singapore. How are we going to implement all these great grand projects if we don't beef up our capacity to deliver? Do you know a whole lot of countries are wanting to make investments in India? Forget the One Belt, One Road. Forget the Chinese, Japanese and various others. We are not being able to come up with worthwhile projects where money can go in. So let's not just talk about BRICS. Yes, the BRICS Bank is a good thing, and let me correct those who are saying BRICS has done damn all. The bank has distributed money much quicker than World Bank and IMF has done in the past several decades. In the last 2-3 years, they've distributed $3 billion worth of 2 major project initiatives, and many more are going in local currency.
Sure.
So the BRICS is making a difference.
Okay, the BRICS is making a difference. Let me get in Samir Saran. I wonder if he has a slightly different view on the impact of BRICS as a grouping, because Samir, many believe that its influence has waned considerably, at least since the time of inception. While together they've, BRIC nations have outgrown other developing countries marginally and significantly outgrown developed countries if you were to look at the, at the GDP growth rate. But the fact of the matter is that, Russia, China and, Russia, South Africa and Brazil are on a weak footing because the commodities meltdown. You had Brazil and South Africa take a significant knock. So the economic reality has changed. So to that extent, would you say that the heft of the BRIC nation has waned to some extent, and it's now more about India and China than about BRICS?
So, I would appraise BRICS through 2 lenses. If you are looking at, if you're purely looking at whether markets are celebrating the BRICS as they used to, say, 7 or 8 years ago, I would say clearly that market sentiment is going south, simply because, like you mentioned, Brazil and South Africa have lots to do at home. Russia, as Maruf indicates, is perhaps the most important geopolitical actor today, the second most powerful security actor, certainly. But I think BRICS will also need to be appraised through a political prism. I think it has a normative value which is quite powerful. Like Maruf mentioned, the number of, I think, 5 or 7 projects that have already taken off, courtesy the NDB, it's the partnership with the AIIB, which is pouring in more money, the fact that you now have a NDB Africa chapter in South Africa, lends it a huge political space, and we sometimes underestimate the normative value of BRICS unless we go and speak to people in Africa and speak to people in Southeast Asia. I think they see BRICS far more differently than many in India, who I think are perhaps cynical about this grouping since its birth and since its inception. But having said that, I clearly see limitations to what BRICS can do, even in terms of governance reforms. I think there are, in my recent article, I have called BRICS a limited purpose partnership, and I think we have to be honest in terms of what we want it to do. If BRICS is going to deliver a UNSC seat to India, then we are living in a fool's world. It's not. But is it going to help India and other emerging economies get more space in the financial institutions, in the political governance institutions outside of the UNSC? I think certainly India's voice is given more heft when some of the other major emerging economies raise the same issue. So in that sense, governance reforms to a certain extent, BRICS will work. Financial institutions to make up for the huge infrastructure financing deficit that exists in the developing world, in spite of the world having a glut of savings today, is something that BRICS can work on. Putting more life into trading regimes, is certainly something the BRICS can work on. But most importantly, and I have always said this, and sometimes in a sardonic way, that BRICS is essentially about three countries: Russia, India, and China. And Brazil and South Africa are basically to ensure they are the classroom monitors to make sure that we three behave ourselves. For their own reasons, they find a huge merit in being here, because Brazil from the left of the map suddenly finds itself as part of the Asian century, and South Africa certainly sees itself as the gateway to Africa, and if it can be that African voice like it is at the G20 as well, it adds to its credentials in that particular continent.
Fair point. Actually, I think even Jim O'Neill said that he never envisaged South Africa to be a part of BRICS, because he says that China creates one South Africa every 4 months. But Meera Shankar, I'm going to bring this to you. And while we are a little skeptical about BRICS being as influential as it was envisaged to be, because it's only standing on two legs, that's India and China, and commodity crash has completely busted the other three. But do you believe, realistically speaking, if they do get their house in order, BRICS can surpass or can wane the influence of G7, or is that too far-fetched at this stage?
At the moment, I think it's a little beyond the realm of the practical, if you're going to say, but it creates a counterweight. I won't say it reduces the influence of the G7, but it creates space and it creates a counterweight. And I think we have to avoid this tendency to say BRICS is only India and China, because what Brazil and South Africa bring to the table is geographical dispersal and therefore a global reach in a sense of BRICS, because you have Africa represented and you have South America represented, and that's very important. Otherwise it just becomes a little, tripartite arrangement. I would say that looking ahead, the fact that BRICS has endured, despite differences amongst member states, differences of political systems, differences of foreign policy orientation, and direct strategic conflicts among some of the members, it has endured, which means that all the members do see value in the grouping. And that value plays out essentially in the global space, where it creates more weight for the voices of these countries to be heard and pushes for adjustments. I won't say radical reform, but it helps shift the international system in the direction that we would want. So adjustments in the international system, which still continue to happen slowly. And then because we have created a separate bank, created funds and contingent currency reserve and so on, it takes practical shape where conditionalities and so on, which are sometimes put for political reasons, don't get the play that they get otherwise in those negotiations. So that's the space where I see BRICS working.
All right.
I don't see that
I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm just going to interrupt you. We've just got 30 seconds. We've just got 30 seconds on the debate. I want to get a quick comment from Professor Nag before we wrap things out, which is on the point that Xi Jinping made in the address, which is something that you made in your opening comments as well. The reality is such that US has vacated its space as being the champion of globalization in many ways. Can India and China come together and occupy that space? Is that even feasible? Or as Sushant Sareen pointed out, it's too unrealistic given the significant strategic differences of opinion that we have on a whole host of issues. It's impossible for the two countries to come together and occupy that space vacated by the United States. Professor Nag.
I think we are moving from a bipolar or a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and I like what Meera Shankar had said about flexible geometry. It's not going to be just India and China. It's going to be India, China, Europe, USA, Japan, Korea, and certainly BRICS. So I think we've got to get away from thinking of always either or, a binary situation. India and China will certainly play a very important role going forward. And I think the debate has to be cast in a larger context. And though I fully agree with my colleagues that India will have to take care of its national interests, just as China will, But I do feel that in India, somehow we are too over concerned about what will China say. I think we should think of what will India say or India do in our interest. But the fact is, India and China will account for 1/3 of the world's population, more than 1/3 of the global output, and they'll be number 1 and number 2 on both counts. So we can't just get away from the fact that we need each other, and a win-win proposition for the two of us is much better than a zero-sum game. That's the bottom line.
So no longer India or China, but India and China. But on that note, can't thank my panel enough for this very, very thought-provoking discussion. Ms. Meera Shankar, Professor Rajat Nag, Maroof Raza, Sushant Sareen and Samir Saran. Thanks very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. On a parting note, to get the Shaiman statement on the Chinese soil is no mean achievement. Yes, Pakistan hasn't been named, and yes, we do not know the fate of Masood Azhar, but BRICS represents over 42% of this world's population, and that itself wields a lot of influence.
One thing is certain, today we've proven to the world what can happen if India and China can set aside differences and converge together for their common strategic interests. The possibilities are endless. Hopefully, we'll find our way of doing so. Thank you so much for being with us on the India Development Debate this Monday evening. Top 10 at 10 is right up next on ET Now. Thanks for watching.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.